Less than 1/3 of Americans have trust in the media as a whole. It has so little trust that at times the media looks as though they don't even care anymore about trying to force false narratives or even create the news themselves. One of the more vacuous online outlets is the Huffington Post, which is bleeding readership like other outlets of the controlled media and are desperate to get eyeballs back onto what President Donald Trump calls the fake news. Enter Dana Leibelson, who works as a quote-unquote reporter over at the HuffPost, and she seemed to be a little startled when President Trump called out the media for their nebulous and cancerous coverage, but more so their agenda and their lies. In a series of tweets, she said, "I'm genuinely concerned that speeches like the one last night are going to lead to violence against reporters." And it would seem she's oblivious and doesn't note that the MSM agenda bears little resemblance to the thoughts, wishes, and concerns of the public they have betrayed time and time and time again. At this point, journalism is dead. Now, it's not a shock that the mainstream media pushes specific coverage or ignores certain topics for ratings, ad revenue, and clicks. The problem is when these organizations are just making up information or purposely ignoring context of something they're covering to further an agenda. And we see this every day in the MSM. It's a very sad time for journalism, especially if you work for any of the major corporate-controlled news outlets. When Dana's initial tweet was met with almost universal condemnation and disgust for MSM quote-unquote journalists and the media itself, she seemed to be as befuddled as most reporters are when confronted by those the media claims to be serving, especially when they call them out for their bias and disingenuousness. The example of lies, omissions, the lack of context and misleading information spouted by the mainstream media is absolutely endless, but I will stick to what is a very relevant topic for this week: Antifa. Since the Charlottesville riots that were precipitated by the odious Antifa, who arrived in body armor, helmets, and brandished weapons, and also had no legal right to assemble, the media has been covering and, more importantly, lying to the American people about what Antifa is and what it does. The American mainstream media has described the rabid Marxist communist organization that's drenched in blood and thirsts for violence as quote-unquote anti-racists, counter-demonstrators, anti-Nazis, fighters against the rise of fascism in the USA. But the lying media never tells you what they really are. This is a group that has its ideological underpinning to communism, Marxism, radical anarchism, as well as an overwhelming hatred for the freedoms guaranteed in the Constitution. And it looks to overthrow the existing societies throughout the West, with violence preferably. And the hallmark of Antifa is their face coverings used to hide their identities when engaging and orchestrating their infamous wanton street violence. But if we want to be serious, and in reality their ranks are made up by middle-class, champagne socialist, communist, anarchist white boys who don't like nationalists. They consider themselves to be rebelling against the establishment whilst upholding all of its ultra-politically correct views, ironically not realizing they are the stormtroopers of global finance and capitalism. Most are teenagers and university students who live in their parents' basements, but they do grow out of playing masked dress-up and smash the fash when they start paying taxes. But when they are active, they're violent. Very, very violent. Violent against the young, the elderly, men and women. Recently, the internet den of scum and villainy, also known as 4chan's poll, has been putting together memes for dispersal on social media. These memes stressed the real and indiscriminate violence that Antifa unleashes on those that have any kind of opinion they disagree with. The memes used photos, mostly from anti-domestic abuse campaigns, and they highlighted the fact that Antifa would attack anyone that disagrees with them, which they do. In fact, 3 days ago, they dragged to the floor an elderly woman and beat her to a pulp. I'll have a link to that video in the description, as YouTube will do almost anything to censor these kinds of videos that get the truth out to people about what Antifa is really all about. Either way, the BBC rushed to the rescue of Antifa today. They called the memes in their headline a far-right smear campaign against Antifa, and they were the ones that exposed it, as if these violent thugs could be smeared. And yes, let that sink in for a minute. The BBC, which is taxpayer-funded to the tune of tens of billions of pounds, is now spending its resources to track down the source of internet memes in order to protect violent street thugs like Antifa from a so-called smear campaign orchestrated by an anime-centered image board. The article continued and highlighted the virtues of Antifa and condemned what it called a campaign that appeared to have the aim to discredit Antifa groups. Yeah, lads, that's right. I'm really not even sure that they believe their own lies anymore, because Antifa has been active much longer in Europe than it has in the US. Anyway, this is just one of dozens, hundreds of editorial pieces meant to normalize and justify Antifa and their wanton violence. In fact, and this is just an aside, but I have just received a temporary ban and was told that my BPS Facebook page would be closed because I posted this picture taken from Twitter of what looks like Islamic State fighters holding an Antifa flag. It's not hard to see that the mainstream media and social media companies and the ilk that makes up the bulk of their employees are desperate and are doing everything they can to stop people from making the connection between Antifa and the organization's real goals. So the question is, what is Antifa now in America really all about? In the last few days, several prominent Antifa websites have been promoting the expansion of the far-left group Revolutionary Abolitionist Movement, or RAM. It's Going Down, Sub.media, and Insurrection News published articles and took to Twitter to encourage their followers to donate to a fundraiser account to help RAM launch a new cell in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Well, what do we know about RAM? Well, according to its website, the Revolutionary Abolitionist Movement is a political movement dedicated to freeing people from bondage and building resistance in the United States. And just like every other Antifa group, they oppose white supremacy, racism, and bigotry. Seems reasonable, right? But read a little further into their political foundation and you will find a few things that aren't so reasonable. The group advocates for the abolition of gender. They advocate for the expropriation of goods, lands, and tools. And finally, just like every other Antifa group, they oppose capitalism and are open proponents of communism as a political ideology, which I might add has been responsible for the death of almost 100 million people, but I guess that's just incidental. And RAM has been conducting a series of workshops at their Brooklyn, New York branch designed to, and I quote, radicalize a new generation of revolutionaries. These include an introduction to anarchism class as well as Our Enemies in Blue, which is an anti-police workshop. That's right, this group is educating their recruits in anti-police workshops, and they're called, and I quote, Our Enemies in Blue. So in answering Ms. Leibelson's tweet and her apparent bafflement at the hostility most people have toward the mainstream media, well, I guess that the vast majority of the people do not believe a word you say, Dana, and the words you write have time and time again caused violence in the streets of America for the sole purpose of ratings and clicks. Your industry is bereft of integrity and lacking in ethics. The media has divided the country, and your industry has lied time and time again without shame. The media is despised by the people for the injury you have inflicted upon them and society. But don't listen to me. Read some of the responses to the tweets that you wrote on this subject. All you need to know about the public's contempt for the media can be found in there. And if you still don't understand, why not write another article on the heroic nature of Antifa? Gotta keep pushing that narrative, Dana. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please consider supporting this channel via Patreon. You can also find Black Pigeon on the usual social media and also see the homepage blackpigeonspeaks.com for more interesting information like this.